That's right. I have wrestled with an alligator. I done tussled with a whale. I done handcuffed lightning, throw thunder in jail.
You can't stop me.
I'm going to win.
It ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
I won't quit.
I'll just keep getting stronger.
Stronger?
Stronger.
Okay, we're just going to roll. I'm not even going to introduce it. Hey, we're on the pump. We're talking the pump stuff. But we have this good conversation, and we're just going to start it over, sort of. Because we're talking about overload. We're talking about overload progressives. So, like, tell us about the overloaded progressives.
Yeah, well, so that's what I tried to do, is by critiquing the industry's, like, kind of current content on progressive overload, I was hoping that I could overload some progressives at the same time with some sharp opinions and, you know, some very blunt statements. But I think it was like June 5th or so, I put out a post that basically said, hey, I want to know all the questions everybody has on volume and progressions, because right now I don't think anybody has done a good job of like leaving people with a good understanding, or at least a usable understanding of that information. And this came off the back end of watching just a bunch of material. We take pretty much like every course, or, you know, absorb every piece of content that we can out there. And I watched this video. It's like a 9-minute video on progressive overload from another education provider. And I was just like, man, if I was a trainer right now and I had watched that, like, I literally have no like good tools, no good thought process, like it's essentially, it's like worthless information, because there's just not enough context. And I think if you look at, there's a lot of people that have done some good podcasts covering this stuff on a theoretical side. You got Eric Helms has done quite a few, Brian Miner, obviously Mike Isertel's given his side of it on like this more set dominant version. But a lot of these things have, you know, they're covered in like either a theoretical aspect or a over mathematical aspect, and never in a applicable of like, well, here's actually the, you know, here's the base principles of how you would use this to guide your decisions. Or if it is, that's glossed over so quickly that it's like, man, there's so much more to this. And it's very easy to walk away from some of these other, whatever it is, a podcast, a course, or whatever, and have a very, like, we'll say a naive understanding of how much control you have, or how individualized you can get in terms of what we would call progressive overload.
Yeah, well, that's like why we wanted to bring you on. And like, I've listened to all of it too, and like I would consider myself a dummy with all this. Mm-hmm. But I think that a lot of people will sit here and they'll listen to a podcast and they'll go out of it thinking like, I thought I knew, but but like I don't know. So like now am I fucked? Like, or
well, I think the argument became so binary. It was like, you just got to go in and work hard, add more weight to the bar, or no, you just have to add more volume and you'll be fine. And like no one took anything in the gray area in between.
Well, that became the thing, like, because if I'm looking at like an end user, but even myself when I'm like learning all this stuff is like with the sets model, it's like, hey, more is better. And then Eric's like, well, no, more is more, but more could be better. And then better could be more. But better might not be more. And it's like, well, now what? And that's where I like your approach, because like I like the n=1 approach. Like obviously we're all in an echo chamber and we like our biases, but n=1 to me is basically like we can figure out those individual contexts, but then put out the right stimulus or the right answer to your individual context. And I think it's good that we bring you on so people understand that, as opposed to buying into just one binary system of whatever is being pushed, because then you're stuck. If it's not the right answer for you, then what? You know what I mean?
So Cass, what's your definition? Like, give us.
Yeah, let's start definitions.
Yeah. Well, that's good, because like one of my litmus tests for this was I actually put out a poll asking people to define progressive overload, right? And I got like almost 200 definitions back from people, and I would consider my following fairly educated. I mean, they're listening to all the same podcasts or whatever, right?
What was the best one? Sorry, what was the like top 3 bad ones? I like, and you don't think, oh, I like bad ones because it's probably my answer.
Well, I don't know that you would classify them in good or bad, but I will say in terms of like the volume of reporting, you had a good chunk of people that said, hey, it's either progressing in like sets or reps. And then you had another chunk of people that said, well, it's about progressing stimulus, or it's in some way related to stimulus. Those were kind of like the two dominant. And then a much smaller portion was getting into like, well, okay, it's a like volume, like maybe you could add something other than sets or reps, like maybe you can include tempo or sets, or you could adjust other training variables as part of that. And keep in mind, this is a biased answer because this is my following, so it's a little bit my echo chamber. And so when we look at the definition of progressive overload, it's basically, you have to look at what am I trying to progress. So I think because of the strength world, people initially just like said, okay, it's progressive load. We just add load. And then people became a little bit more open-minded, be like, well, you could also add reps or whatever, and that increases tonnage and whatnot. But if we actually look at what overload represents, overload means that we are going beyond our homeostasis. We are disrupting the system in some way, shape, or form, producing a stimulus. So for me, overload isn't a single metric. For me, overload is like, okay, I am adding something to that stress, that training, that whatever, right? That disrupts that system in the way that I want, that accomplishes the stimulus that I want. And then the ability to express that is a sign that I was still getting those adaptations. And I think there was a couple people that almost took like a philosophical approach to defining progressive overload and saying, well, progressive overload is not what you do. Progressive overload is the result, meaning that like if you can do more, you are achieving progressive overload, or progressive overload occurred. And then it kind of ends up in this like chicken or the egg thing. And like, well, wait a second. You had to overload to get the adaptation. Is the adaptation now progressive overload? Are we using the term within the definition? Or does it really matter as long as we have the same ideas? Is that what we need to do is we need to constantly make some sort of progression when we are starting to get to that realm where we're not going to get a stimulus if we don't change. We're going to stay the same. Right? And I guess it doesn't matter if you look at the progressive overload as the application of the overload or the result of the overload, as long as from a principle perspective, you understand that the whole goal is you're like the stimulus that you need to hit is a moving target as we adapt.
The philosophical
right? So,
guys are all small.
Yeah, that's true.
Like what it is the chicken or the egg argument.
Yeah.
I would have loved to like just, we can get back on track, but it was just like when I was watching your live and like some dude was asking you a question and like you weren't being a dick, you're just walking. You're like, dude, you don't even understand it. So like, don't ask that question because it's a dumb question essentially. You can go read a book. But you were actually saying like, go read a book. But it's like when you get those answers, like it's like, okay, buddy.
Yeah.
Like, you're just, like you can sound smart, it's fine. It's just like I'm trying to educate from a principle-based approach, and like this missed the mark a bit.
A lot of times people want to have a conversation that they're just simply not prepared to have yet. Like from an education to knowledge perspective, it's like for instance, if I want to have a conversation with somebody on, quantum physics, like I got to have a wealth of knowledge to be able to be a part of that conversation, to have the context and the foundational information. And so
that's why
you get that a lot.
That's why it's good to have this, because I think like if you look at even Gemini, the guy asked about like the electric stim stuff, and I was like, I'm not gonna ask Cass. I don't have no fucking clue what's going on. Like that's why we're asking you. But it's like this volume thing. A lot of people, and like ourselves included, because there is all this shit out there. We're not qualified to even listen to these conversations and come out with an answer that suits us. And so that's why it's kind of sweet that we define it. And I know the way you're going to go with it, we can at least all bring up the bottom so that we can listen to these conversations and like understand what the fuck's going on, to even evaluate it critically. Because I think that's the part too, is that it's not critically evaluated because we trust the sources. It's like, hey, well, I trust Eric, I trust Mike, I trust N1, I'm fucking done. Like I'm not going to go look at it myself and like figure out what my n equals 1 is, because it's like, well, Mike's huge. Like, fuck yeah, I'm going to do that. Or Eric's smart. I can't say Eric's huge because he's not as big as Mike, but, and you know what I mean? So like, that's what I want to avoid. I want to like bring up the bottom so that they can take stuff and take your courses and ask you questions and get answers that are relevant.
Yeah. So to reel that back in for everybody, just to come up with a very like clear definition, for me, progressive overload is the manipulation of training so that I continue to get a stimulus as I achieve, as I acclimate adaptations or accumulate adaptations, so that I'm continuing to stimulate and adapt and continuing to stimulate and adapt over time, you know. And the things to clarify with that is that you have a window of like different amounts of stress and stimulus that will yield an adaptation. It's not like, well, if I did 100 pounds this week, that if I did 100 pounds next week, that it would be zero stimulus. Like it just kind of depends. You have a window of which you can use things. And so you can make really small progressions over time, or you can kind of, you know, make big progressions more infrequently. A lot of that, again, is going to come down to the N of 1 of what's more practical and what makes more sense based off of the stimulus you're trying to achieve. And I think that's where, from a semantics or terminology standpoint, that we tend to differ very much. Is like, well, if you, like, for instance, if you listen to most people when they say stimulus, they just stimulus is this general thing, almost like this magical thing that just happens, that makes good things happen to your physique or your strength or whatever. And we look at stimulus as like, well, stimulus, like if we're programming for stimulus, we probably need to be a little bit more specific than that, right? So if the goal is to get stronger, right, well, then the direction you want to progress is in load. If the goal is to get more conditioned, then the direction that you want to progress in is things that are more metabolically taxing or aerobically taxing, or like they're taxing those systems. So when we say progressive overload, if we just say, well, it's just more, it's got to be more of what you want to get the stimulus that you're going for, so that you get the specific adaptations that you're going for. And so there is a direction to these adaptations. There's a direction of progression. And I think that's where the overly reductionist view of, you know, stimulus and volume can leave people with a not very applicable or usable like tool set when it comes to progressive overload. Because it's like, well, when do I progress in what? And that's why I can make a rationale for utilizing a lot of tools, right? Not just reps and load, not just sets, but a whole bunch of things, because we can have a clearly defined stimulus that we're trying to achieve. And if that's the case, there's a most efficient option.
Yeah, and you know, just from a solely anecdotal and, you know, crappy science perspective, personally, I find when I start to learn and exercise better, and I'm able to apply the tools to actually hit muscle groups I'm trying to, you know, I mean, you guys talk about this a lot. Like, just doing a bench press doesn't necessarily hit your pecs. You know, you have to be doing a bench press correctly. And when I hit it, I find that actually, as I work through my mesocycle, I might need less sets because I'm actually hitting the muscles hard. So I might get to that third set and see a drop off of, you know, 3 reps and be like, oh, okay, like I'm actually doing this, I guess, less efficiently, but I'm hitting the muscles better. So it kind of plays to that. Like, it's not just the volume, it's the right volume.
Because you could just keep doing it shitty and then add more
I could
volume.
have done 4 sets with shitty reps that didn't hit the, you know.
But it was good for Instagram.
Yeah. And that's the difference between viewing volume and progressive overload through the tissue and stimulus you're driving versus this external number of just like how much weight was moved through space. Right. It's like, well, okay, like the bar going through the air, like, does not actually change your body. It's what's going on internally that's making that bar move. That's what's changing the body. And, you know, like the example that you gave, if you get better at using more, say, chest and less delts and less triceps, that's could be a big enough jump in overload for the, you know, the mechanical tension in the chest. It's the same equivalent as adding weight exclusively to your pecs, right? And that's where people need to get the mindset of like, okay, weight is a tool, reps are a tool, sets are a tool, or whatever. But like, what are they doing? Because that's what I need to figure out is what do I want to be happening? How do I make a progression in that? You know, and I'm the same way. If you were to take and put me on like what a beginner would be able to survive, like it would murder me, because one, as you advance in training age, one, you're using heavier weights,
Yeah.
right? But you're able to also like really focus that tension and stuff a lot more. Your neural drive is better, your neurological efficiency is better. So it's like you have the ability to disrupt your tissue in a much more efficient fashion. So if you just throw the same amount of work on paper at an advanced athlete as what a beginner athlete may be able to tolerate, and still be like, oh, that's not so bad. It's very different. Like you can crush some advanced people with some pretty tame looking, you know,
Volume, yeah.
programs on paper.
Well, I think to your point too, from a psychological aspect, this measuring of total volume for a lot of people who are in this game are hyper competitive. Maybe they're ex-athletes. They're going to try to beat that volume number regardless of quality of reps. Like if they're like, I got 30,000 pounds last week, I got to get 30. Yeah. Right, Dean? Like you're going to crush it even if the quality of your reps is less. And
the thing is, I think everyone, this is the fucked up thing, is like we all talk about it like more is more, but especially that crowd that you're talking about, they know their fucking reps are shit. Like no, like, you know what I mean? Like no one's going to admit like that didn't feel good. But so it's interesting because that's where it lands. And I guess like what I want to get out of this for the end user is I think a lot of these discussions, and especially these higher level ones, they apply to a very small population, right? Because like you said, Cass, like you do this thing and it's going to fuck you up because like you have intent and you have the mechanical tension, you have the overload, you have the technique. Where does it fit from this beginner intermediate? Because they're going to listen to this and then be like, well, more is like when they're looking at these camps or even this discussion, how do they evaluate what overload they need to kind of progress them through that system of beginner to intermediate to then getting to the point where all this shit might actually matter a little bit more, because that's principle based, and then you can talk about minutia. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm working on with the progressive overload course we have right now. Is it's like how do we take all of this complex and nuances and make it so that like even a beginner can like easily like apply these principles without having to be a lot of thought, right? And you know, sometimes the simplest way is that if you look at the type of training you're doing and you were to say like, okay, what am I going for, and then what would be the physical expression or manifestation of those adaptations, right? So obviously if my goal is that I'm trying to improve strength, then that should be the number one factor, you know, that I'm looking at to evaluate. If I'm trying to improve conditioning, then that should be the thing that I'm looking at. And that can be a factor of, you know, workout density, or, you know, how many reps I can do at a given load, etc. And then the mess happens in the middle, which is the mechanical tension model. And that's because it's not just that there's a majority of ways to get mechanical tension. It's just that you have, essentially, it's like you could, if you add load, you're going in one direction. If you're adding reps, you're going in another direction. Then you have all these other things in terms of, you know, working at a higher RPE or adjusting tempo or rest, all these other things that become factors into that mechanical tension based realm, right? So hypertrophy, if you kind of go, you know, some people say hypertrophy is the easiest. I remember one of the first program design courses I taught, the description for the hypertrophy program. It's like, well, what is the design, whatever, and it was just crush. Like that's the programming variable. It's like crush.
Yeah, work.
Literally, that ended up being the theme of the whole weekend. Like, well, what are you doing? Crush. Like, cool. That is the scientific definition of how you train for hypertrophy, is crush, right? You know, which, I mean, there is a bit of truth to that, right? But and in a beginner, you know, how you go about hypertrophy is much less important than once you start to, you know, accumulate a bit of training age.
Yeah.
But I think it's not fair to say that just because a lot of things work for a beginner doesn't mean that they work the most efficiently. And so a lot of what we're doing when we're applying nuances, or we're trying to get people to be a little bit more mindful, is to take into consideration that, like, okay, while this may seem trivial compared to some of the other things over the course of 6 weeks or 10 weeks, over the course of 5 years, it's not going to be trivial. It's not going to be trivial from a joint perspective, from a health perspective, you know, from an injury perspective, and from a results perspective. It's just that, you know, if I just, you know, if you're a beginner and you just decide to go do German volume training, which is just an arbitrary 10
Crush.
All right. Yeah. Crush. Like, how do you crush? Well, you know what's a lot? 10 sets of an exercise isn't a lot. So just do that. You're almost guaranteed to accomplish the crush in that sense. So what we can look at is we can look at what you're trying to accomplish and figure out how we can tangibly make adjustments towards your goal. So like I said, if your goal is strength, the thing that you should probably be progressing most is load on the bar. And when that doesn't move, then you have to look at, okay, what is another adaptation or another, you know, training variable I can adjust? Or does that mean that now I have reached the conclusion of this particular phase or block, right? It's no longer yielding significant enough adaptations that I can continually make progress, which if you're doing a program and it stops making progress in the direction that you are trying to take it, that means you're probably reaching the point of diminishing returns there. And I think a lot of people, you know, I'm not a like you should hop programs, but I think a lot of people also will just like, well, I'm just going to stay the course and stay the process, because now that becomes a badge of honor. It's like, well, even though I wasn't getting results, I stuck through it for like 4 weeks and then I started getting results again. I'm like, well, yeah, basically you probably just had shitty performance for 4 weeks and your body
Well, but that's
selectively deloaded for you.
Yeah.
But that's
right?
the understanding most people go into. So like, I'm thinking like beginner, it's like, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's usually they go and I want to get bigger, and they correlate strength with getting bigger because they don't know any better. And if we can kind of switch that mindset to understanding like there are different things, like how do you know when you should move on from the shitty program, or how do you evaluate that it was shitty? Because I think that's the main thing is, like you said, everything works, especially in that phase. It's like, and so it's hard to say what's more efficient because you're talking about looking down the line. How do you convince people to kind of look at those things and know that they're going to work down the line? Because you're talking 2, 3, 4 years, and homeboy is saying, well, my military press stopped going up, so my shoulders aren't getting bigger. Like, shut the fuck up. I want them big now.
Yeah. Well, you just have to get people focused on a different goal of what they need to accomplish, right? Because it could be good.
There we go.
You're gonna have to cut it now. All right, we're good now.
I'm probably not gonna cut it because like it's a lot of work, and like it's kind of funny watching like because you be my overload, do more weight, and that's all we heard. And so you actually said to do more volume, like that's all you said there.
Yeah. Don't be lazy. I'll cut it for you.
No, I'll do it.
Like 2 seconds.
I'm gonna let a little bit of it stay. I think
Okay.
that's the honesty of it all.
Yeah.
Like Cass might know a lot of things. He still doesn't always have good internet.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Colorado just is. I think that's like the thing. It's like a tax on bandwidth for cell phones and Wi-Fi and whatever. It's just like, yeah, if you want to see the mountains, that's gonna
Right. That's the trade-off.
Yeah.
See, we
Dude, honestly, Kale's
Yeah.
got shitty Wi-Fi too. My friend Kale that lives in Colorado. That might be the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's weird because I have like gigabit Wi-Fi. It's just that it just will randomly just all of a sudden be crap.
You know, the trick is to do a speed test, because then they know you're checking if your speed's on point, and they throttle you back up. Because no, it's actually true. Like I know a tech guy is like, just do a speed test, because then they'll flag you as someone to not fuck with. And so I do one. It works every time. It's so weird. Anyways, we were talking about homeboy in the gym not progressing. which is an avatar for most people not progressing. I think whether you're in beginner or intermediate, because you can't evaluate whether this thing's working because everything works until it doesn't. And then you don't know which way to go now because we're not actually listening to things. And then we go on the podcast and it's like, we'll just do more or do more sets, or you got to start thinking about all the variables. And they're like, well, I only knew this variable, the one variable, like now there's 10, like, fuck, man. So anyways.
Well, the problem with not progressing is that if you limit yourself to what things you're measuring for progression, you're going to think you're not progressing a lot sooner. And hypertrophy is the hardest thing to measure acute progressions in, right? Because it's like, okay, cool, right? Like I got like 1 extra contractile unit today. Like, what does that mean? I can lift like 20 more grams for a 1/10 of a rep. So I think this is where like the RPE and RIR stuff can be very valuable. Is if people get a very basic understanding of the effective reps, and if all they get from that is that, you know, if I'm going for hypertrophy, I need to be working at a, you know, a relative, you know, proximity to failure, right? Like my sets have to be challenging at the end. Like those are the reps. And the very simple way of looking at that is we try and do like a little illustration in the course, but is that hypertrophy is dependent on how much tension you get at the muscle fiber level, at least when we're talking about mechanical tension as the main driver. And strength is an expression on tendon to tendon. So literally, if you were to take the two ends of your muscle and figure out how much force you could pull between that, that's how we express strength, right? The force that the entire muscle can generate. But in terms of hypertrophy, this is not a very good expression of hypertrophy, because at any given moment, we're only contracting a certain percentage of our fibers. And the thing that actually tells us that we need more fibers is when those individual fibers become stressed.
What's like your sumo deadlift argument?
Yeah, well, that's a biomechanical aspect of it, right? It's like we need to load the tissue. That would be more of a tendon to tendon.
Yeah.
This is more of like, if, for instance, as we fatigue, it's very simple. Like I'm doing 20-pound bicep curls, right? That 20-pound dumbbell stays 20 pounds the entire time. It doesn't start morphing into something else. So at the beginning of that, I have all of my bicep fibers are fresh and ready to go and contribute to that, meaning they can share that load more. And what happens is I fatigue is some of those fibers, they're just not ready or able to now contribute. So now the load of that dumbbell starts getting shared between fewer and fewer fibers, which means basically the net tension on those fibers starts to go up. And that's essentially the simplest way. There's a lot of nuances going in there, just, you know, for any nuance, you know, people out there, there's a lot of things going on. But that's the simplest way to look at, well, effective reps and mechanical tension. It's like I have to get to the point where the fatigue is creating a situation where now whatever I'm doing is acting on fewer fibers. So therefore those fewer fibers are having to do more work, right? It's just like, you know, if you and 3 buddies are carrying, you know, a big table or a bed frame or something, right? And then all of a sudden you get down a hallway where 2 of you have to let go and let the other 2 go. The 2 remaining are doing significantly more work. That's the condition we're trying to create in the muscle tissue. And that's where we're getting closer to fatigue. We're getting to the higher RPEs, the lower IRRs, and that's where we see the change of velocity. The reason the velocity all of a sudden starts to drop off is you have fewer fibers that are actually working.
That's a good analogy, though.
Load.
It's a good analogy for real, though, because like it's kind of goes back to this whole understanding of the system and like not understanding, like, having an understanding that this thing's harder, but not understanding why. And it's like sometimes you have the one buddy who like is pretending to lift and he's not, and it's harder, and you're thinking like fuck, this is way harder, and it's because this thing's heavy, when really it's because fucking asshole is pretending to lift. But like that's why this conversation's important, because like what's doing what is essentially like what you're getting at.
Well, I think this also comes back to, you know, everyone poo-poos this idea of like when people say you have to learn to work hard, but if you've never truly gone to failure, you've got no fucking idea what that feels like. And so you're like, oh, I was, you know, 2 RIR. And it's like, no, dude, you were 16 RIR. Like and I think that's where the work hard thing comes in. It's like, okay, once you've established, how to push that, then you can start playing with these, these measurements. But until then, it's like, I mean, you're just guessing. So are you really pushing yourself to getting those fatigued fibers working?
And that's one of the reasons that even at a beginner level, like for the most part, we encourage some degree of training to complete failure, especially on certain exercises, because it gives you a constant barometer of like what a 0 RIR or a 10 RPE is, right? And so now I think the problem with like the people looking at the research is like you're either comparing all sets taken to failure or none, which nobody like. To me, both of those are very suboptimal, training methods, and that's a big problem with the research on this stuff with volume and intensity or whatever. It's just like oftentimes we're just comparing a bunch of like which one of these sucks more instead of actually focusing on which one, like how do people really train, like what is actually like a legit good training protocol. And so since we never do that, people take the conclusions of how to train based off of the difference between two crappy protocols. Like,
yeah, it's like I'm going to go to failure all the time, but like if you use failure to understand what failure is so you can be effective, then like that's smart. But I don't think, especially when you look at evidence-based, it's like you said, it ends up being that is the principle.
Yeah, and they're like it's inefficient, it doesn't work, and I'm like, no one's going to shut down their systemic fatigue levels from doing a set of one-arm cable extensions, tricep extensions to failure. Like there's nothing bad's going to happen there.
And the people who know how to get to failure, because I can pretty much at this point look at people at the gym and know that some people know how to get to failure and some don't. But like you know what I mean? So I don't know. Like I actually like where you're going with this. So continue.
Yeah. So we use an ascending intensity spectrum almost, we'll say probably at least like 80% of the time. That meaning that there's an RPE climb over the course of your set. So you finish with a top set or whatever, right? Now it doesn't, I mean, some people use top sets and it's this radically different thing than their other sets, right? For us, it's more of like, well, it's kind of like a slow climb. So for instance, if you're doing, 5 sets, you might have a 7, an 8, another 8, a 9, and a 10 or something like that. Like you're working up over the course of those 5 sets. So, and usually if we're thinking that we're trying to constrain the rep range, you're using like an ascending load, right? Or you could use a consistent load and ascend the reps, or a combination. There's a ton of different ways that you could do it, but the goal would be is that your overall, intensity or proximity to failure is climbing up. And when we do the theoretical math on that versus taking, say, your first set to failure and then having decreased performance over the subsequent sets, or even doing the like sub-maximal work, we'll say, well, I'm going to do 5 sets of 8 and an 8 part, so 5 sets at an 8 RPE. And so what you'll see is people will either do less reps or less load on all of the subsequent. And when I use ARM model for trying to calculate how many effective reps would be in there, having the failure point at the end seems to be much better than having the failure point at the beginning, because simply you're like, from a performance standpoint, when you put the failure point early, right? And this happens all the time when we get people that come in here and train, they either come to camps or they come to train with me. I always use this method. And so I got my buddy Joey that lives in LA that comes out here all the time. And he's one of those guys that likes to just go for it on the first set. And I was like, dude, like, you're not going to be hanging if you don't back off. So we'll start off, we're doing like the same weights or whatever, right? And then we're like 3 sets in, and all of a sudden it's like, now it's like, he's dead. And I'm like, I'm just now getting in my groove, and so I can keep climbing that. And the reason for that is that when we look at, we'll say an effective rep, is going to be conditional based off of how much load I can be using and how much internal tension. So tension requires 2 things. It requires, 1, you to be able to actually do the internal contraction of the muscle, right, on a fiber level. But it also requires there to be resistance, which is why that whole like, well, okay, if you do a set of 20 to failure and you do a set of 6 to failure, that it's the last 5 reps is what matters in both. And I'm like, well, no, not really, because I mean, how can you say that these last 5 reps with a much higher load are stimulating the same number of fibers as these other ones that just from a mathematical perspective can't be stimulating the same number of fibers? So with our model for like the effective reps, we actually stretch it out as the rep range gets higher, and it condenses as the rep range gets smaller, meaning that at a heavy load, when you go to failure, more fibers are being stimulated, but you're not stimulating them with as many repetitions. Whereas when you're doing a lot of repetitions and you start to fatigue, you're still stimulating at the fiber level because you've accumulated a lot of fatigue at that point. But each individual rep isn't as stimulating. It's just that maybe, you know, over that period of time, the effective reps window started almost like twice as far out, right? And had kind of like this slow climb. And if you're doing heavy, intense work, it's like, well, I did there. And then the other important thing for that is, depending on what you want to do, the exercise selection, is that task failure determines how much of this like muscular tension you can make, right? Because obviously if you just use too heavy of a load, you have to stop doing it sooner than using a lighter load.
You're chasing effective reps as opposed to chasing effective reps within a binary structure. Because you're getting more, you're essentially trying to maximize how many effective reps you're getting, and the other stuff doesn't matter as much because it'll work itself out, kind of. Like, I know you kind of have some binary system to that, but you're getting more effective reps essentially.
Yeah, so that's my target, and to get effective reps efficiently, I have to have a certain amount of resistance and a certain amount of volume, which means I can't do too low reps and I can't do too high reps if I want to be efficient about it. If I do too low reps, I stimulate a lot of fibers in a single rep, but I don't do enough reps to accumulate enough volume of effective stimulus. If I do a ton of reps, the problem is that I have to do a ton of actual like volume load, like work volume. So the amount of tonnage I have to accumulate to get that same stimulus goes up, which means now there's a lot more metabolic stress, neurological, like it's just simply so much more work. And when you actually model this out, like from a mathematical perspective, it really gives evidence for what we have prototypically thought of as the hypertrophy range from bro science, like forever ago, like 8 to 12. Like when you just look at the math in terms of intensity and volume and kind of how that would correlate to effective reps, it's like, man, this tends to be the sweet spot for an efficiency of stimulus, right? So it's like, okay, yeah, so guys were training this way, not just because they were idiots, but they probably anecdotally seemed to be able to get what they wanted in the most efficient manner.
Well, and that would be your test.
Plus, I think from, you know, again, I always come back to the mindset part of it, the psychological application of having that last set go to failure is, no matter what, if you know you've got 5 sets, like I don't care who you are, even if you blow your wad in the first set, in the back of your head, you know you've got 4 more sets. And if you know it's your last set and you're going to failure, you can really take it to failure. Like mentally, you know, like we were in Costa Rica and that final set came up and we loaded the leg press up and it became a dick measuring contest. I mean, Dean, would you get like 10 more reps than you did the set before?
I won. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, exactly.
He was the biggest underreporter of the group.
So he coasted. He did like 6 reps with like same weight we were doing, like 15
it was
all the previous sets.
But if we look at top sets, like that's, if we look at like how I evaluated top sets, it was always as a powerlifter. It was like sandbag. Oh damn, I went up 120 pounds and now I got my 2 top sets. But that doesn't help me in the context that you're saying, because like I only really had 2 sets and it was not good for hypertrophy because it was just strength based. But I think people get confused with that, because even with defining your version of effective reps, if you look at kind of the arguments, they don't say it like you did. It's like, well, it's just the last fucking 2 reps of this 4 set thing that you did, but like sometimes it's not.
Yeah. Now, if we say, if we look at this all kind of within that stereotypical hypertrophy window, then some of these more kind of like blanketed statements do apply, because it's it's pretty close to, like, if we're talking the 10 rep range, well, yeah, then it's pretty close to the significant reps start at about, your 6th rep, and so then these things start to apply. But it's like, okay, well, all right, the effective reps are the last 5 reps. What if I do a set of 3?
Yeah.
Like,
But then that
how
comes into,
how does that math work out?
well, it doesn't. But that's when we're applying powerlifting concepts to hypertrophy concepts, and the same crowd of people love the same stuff, and they're listening to these same podcasts. But it's like you're talking in a different language almost, and that's where definitions does matter, and it does matter in context, because I would define top sets and powerlifting way different than you did, but that's a strength-based thing. But I don't think people have that understanding of their intent with the wording and the language, and so it does.
Because no one gives a shit about effective reps and strength. The only rep that matters is the one.
But that's what I mean. Like, but then the strength conversation is layered onto the hypertrophy conversation, and they're one and the same for the majority of the population listening to this stuff. Because I would say there's a lot of powerlifters listening to hypertrophy research and talking the same shit, and they're actually talking different things.
Well, this goes again to, like, when I'm saying we focus on specific stimulus. If we're saying effective reps, effective for what? Right. So the effective reps theory that is discussed most often is a mechanical tension model. Mm-hmm. But if we say, well, what's effective for neuromuscular adaptations? Like, then all of a sudden the scale and everything is going to change in terms of how we qualify. Well, what's an effective rep for that?
Yeah,
right. Because that's going to be totally different, or at least it's gonna move along that gradient a little bit. Because if we look at, from a neurological standpoint, there's an argument for, like, well, okay, you get, like, motor unit recruitment goes up as we start to reach fatigue, because the body's trying to reach out to basically larger motor pools to find tissue that's available to work. But that's very different than when we're overcoming a heavy load and then we're reaching out, but basically everything that we're reaching out to is active, versus we're reaching out, but we're basically getting a dead end on the other line from a lot of the tissue. Like, the nervous system is ringing up, and, we're only getting like 30% callback on an actual contractions here. That's where we're at with, seeing motor recruitment go up in fatigue versus motor recruitment go up in demand, from an
but then that leads to the argument that then leads to the conundrum we get to, which is like camps, and then them saying, well, like, that dude is strong. Like, let's just say powerlifter, he's big, and thus that's the way to get big. But what you're saying is you're having a more nuanced approach where you can go these multiple paths, but you have an understanding of the thing that's doing the thing is actually doing the thing, as opposed to not understanding which thing's doing what. And that's where we get into a conundrum, because if we don't think about that, a lot of things work. It's just who's lucky enough to hit the right thing, or like move the right needle without thinking about it. Because I think a lot of the times they don't know what's doing what, but they're like, oh, well, I'm big, so fuck, it's what I'm doing.
And there's lots of ways to get big with drugs are involved too.
Which also fucks everything.
Right. So, we're like, oh, that guy's big, and it's like, he does a lot of volume and does, a lot of drugs. And this guy's big, does low volume, and does, so it changes the pathways to getting big by a lot.
Yeah. And, when we tend to look at when we look at the outliers, they're often the worst case studies for how to do something, because the majority of the people that are spotlit in our industry are in some way, shape, or form an outliers, whether that be through genetics or whether that be through lifestyle of, like, well, what do you do for a living? Like, well, my job is to look like this, right? That's, that's just as much of an outlier as somebody that's, genetically blessed and taking a bunch of juice, because that's still not a realistic scenario for most people to look at. And so, that's just one of those things where success leaves clues is a thing, but it's like, success can leave clues, right? But like, just looking at, who's the best, like, you don't know the starting point or what happened to get there. And the thing that I always try and convince people of is like, look, if you see somebody progress from one point to another point, all you see is what did happen. What you have no idea is what the actual potential was in terms of how good or bad and where they aligned in that spectrum. Because somebody like, oh, look at this guy, like, look at all these transformations he posts, or look at this dude, look how big and jacked he is. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't know that maybe he's only at actually 40% of his potential, but he just happens to be so blessed, or the environment that he's working in just happened to afford him so much that he can perform so suboptimally and still achieve that, right? Or that, you know, if I do you know, an online challenge of 10,000 people come through, you don't think that of those 10,000 people that come through my, you know, worthless program, that I'm not going to get 20 of them that just happen to like change, because they would have changed anyway. Like, so we always have to be cognizant of what we're looking at, because what we're looking at is we're looking at a specific scenario. The thing that we need to be thinking of is like, okay, what could have been done better or worse? Because that's what affects us as the real people. Is we're always looking at, all right, based off of the results we're getting, how do we get more or less from here? Because I can't just like transform my ability to grow to the same as somebody else's.
Well,
right?
I guess
you know,
that leads to like, and you don't have to give away, because this could be like a fucking 10-hour conversation, but where's some starting points principle wise to then self-evaluate those things? So I think that's the issue most people will run into, is they've gotten to this point where they're like, well, fucking this guy's program didn't work. And we can kind of go back to that example, but where do they start to evaluate that to know where to put the needle, or at least like try to figure out where to get those effective reps or where to work harder? Because I think we're going to assume that people want to work hard, the people that we're talking to. Like, they're like, I'll fucking work. But how do we make them not doing it in a dumb way?
You know, and that's where we get into like, where do we go from that philosophy of like, well, if you're progressing, just be happy that you're progressing and just like stay there. Because you don't know, like, am I progressing at my potential, or am I really, really below it right now? Do I just accept that as like the cautionary approach? And this is where like I see kind of like the Eric Helms and Mike Israetel's like really kind of on kind of like polar opposites, right? Whereas one is like, hey, you know, let's push that envelope and make sure that like we reach the end of it. Like we want to find that end destination. And then the more conservative approach is like, hey, if we're making progress, let's just keep making progress. Let's not rock the boat. And in reality, where most people need to be is in between. Right. Yeah. And the thing you have to understand is that when people are speaking on social media or whatever, like having a polarizing opinion is definitely is a good idea. The last thing that people want to hear is, well, it depends and you should think about it, and you know, all of this other stuff. No, just give me the answer, or just have such an extreme opinion that you're going to make half the people really happy and half the people outraged, and that's going to be the most, or you're going to get the most engagement from that. So what you probably need to do is you just need to find that point where, one, you are making progress, right? And then you need to be evaluating that rate of progress. And we tend to focus on a recovery first approach, meaning like if I'm working with somebody, or I should say my team is working with somebody, I've coached them on like try and get people's recovery processes up first, so that then we have more room to try and push the training and the adaptation, right? So, because that's essentially where all the progress is made, is during the adaptation. So we kind of use that as our telltale of is like looking at, okay, if we're doing this, it's not just are you progressing, but like, is your sleep, you know, good? Is your energy good? Like everything, your range of motion. There's so many, like you could look at whatever biometrics that you want to that tend to correlate more towards that thing. But I look to see a decline in those recovery metrics before performance, because oftentimes you will continue to either maintain or improve performance metrics in terms of weights or sets or even the volume that you can do long after you've essentially stopped recovering and adapting to that. So the goal is not to catch you after you've fallen off the cliff.
Yeah.
The goal is to catch you just before you fall off the cliff, right? Because then we didn't waste a week where you put a lot of stress on your body, but you didn't really get a net adaptation for it. You're basically just, because that's what happens when we're no longer progressing. That means at that point in time, we haven't just lost adaptation. We've gotten to the point where now the only place our recovery can bring us to is back to baseline, right? And if that's the extent of what it can get us to, you can be guaranteed that we're not getting, you know, positive or significant adaptations.
I actually like that approach too, because like if I look at myself personally, I don't know how you are, Jeb, but like I'm going off the cliff because I'm trying to maximize that. But like you're basically giving people like a bumper. Bumpers to work with. It's like these things will tell you if you're going off the cliff. And I was like, well, I just want to go that way. Like, well, just a bumper. Just follow it a little bit. That way you're not too conservative, but you're also not too crazy. And I think that you're right. People fall on either end of the spectrum. And I fall on the crazy spectrum.
I definitely fall on the, but that's why working with Ryan's been beneficial, because someone holds me back. Most of it.
You know, and I mean, sometimes there's a psychological component where it's like, I'm going to have planned overreaching because I know this person wants, they want to take it to that level. Like, you know, from whether it just be a mental or character building standpoint. But if you're looking at sheer productivity over the course of a year, like you got 52 weeks, right? And my goal is over those 52 weeks is I'm trying to get the maximum amount of adaptation across all of them. Right. So if I have weeks where all of a sudden I'm working at I'm getting a diminishing returns on that adaptation or no adaptation of progress, right, in the actual areas that I'm going for, which in this case, it may be hypertrophy or physique based stuff. It doesn't matter that I've progressed in other things if it didn't contribute to the net over time. So essentially I'm spending time not either getting the optimal amount of results or not getting result periods. So that means over the course of those 52 weeks, my net progress will be less. So my goal always is to try and do whatever manipulations in terms of programming and periodization so that we are always in a place where we are close to getting as much possible adaptation as possible. And this is where I don't agree with like that, you know, trying to be at the minimum effective dose or the maximal recovery, because to me, both of those places are a place of suboptimal adaptation.
Yeah.
Right. Like my goal is like, okay, how can I get the most out of my time, like from an adaptation standpoint? And I want to be there, and I want to essentially adjust my training as often as possible to stay there. Or I shouldn't say adjust it as often, but it's just as often as needed to stay there and not try and overshoot it and undershoot it. But of course, that's the hardest target to hit, which is why I like using that recovery stuff, because the recovery stuff is going to let me know when I'm starting to get on the other side of, we'll say that, you know, maximum effective volume.
Well,
right?
And are you, and this is actually plays well because that'd be the MEV stuff and the maximal. What's the other one? MAV. Well, there's MAV and then there's
minimal MED, MRV.
Anyways, long story short is, how are you using? Because I know you talked about in your progressive overload stuff with the bell curve and possibly deloading to kind of stay within that effective tension intensity volume thing. And for anyone who's listening, like, there's some shit you're gonna have to pay Cass for. He has a bunch of courses, so like, if you fucking want to learn everything, like, go actually pay for the course. But where do deloads fit into you for that? Because I would argue that, not argue, but I would say that sometimes with the recovery stuff, people use deloads to get that stuff up. But are you trying to like use deloads sparingly? Because I know with that model, they're using them almost every 3 or 4 weeks. Would you rather stay in that middle spot as long as possible and stay near the edge of that cliff as long as possible? And how do you gotta go about that?
So first, let's say that there's 2 ways that you can look at a deload. One is that you just take everything to a minimal level. So it's basically you're recovering every system. But then you can also deload from a specific stress. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't necessarily train in another way that would be beneficial to your net results over time. Yep. And so the further you fatigue your body, stress your body, everything from an immune perspective, a metabolic perspective, neurological, whatever, the more likely it is that you're going to have to like completely deload, meaning that like you're essentially not receiving any stimulus from your training other than you're maintaining your motor patterns and then maybe a small bit of nutrient partitioning so you don't just become, butterbean over the course of a week. What I like to do is, if I don't push that far, it often gives me the time to bring up maybe say other systems that don't get a lot of stimulus in this. And so, I talked a little bit about this on the podcast with Ben House and Ryan on
Metabolic
research. And so what I'll do is if I don't overly push on that 3-4 week block, whatever, is that gives me the opportunity to say like, well, okay, what I could do is I could bring the load down and I could do maybe some high rep stuff, or I could maybe do some like sub-maximal upper lower body supersets or whatever. Like I could bring up either local or systemic conditioning that's going to help my performance and recovery when I jump back into a mechanical tension designed program. But that doesn't happen when you're so fried that you can't train any system to a relative intensity. So I think if you're staying, and if we use the Mike Israetel RP term of maximal effective volume, right, which is somewhere in the middle, if we're staying there, right, we likely have the opportunity to deload from that stimulus, but not have to deload completely from all stimulus or all stimuli.
Well, that's a huge point to make for anyone listening, is because like that's, I don't want to say the negative, but that would be your counter argument to only dealing in volume and sets and tonnage, because now you're talking in stimuluses, but you're still essentially working hard and you're staying on near the cliff of something else while you deload from the other thing to then push it.
Yeah, because if you're just adding stuff, the stimulus you're getting from that training, there may be a mechanical tension element, but you may be progressing maybe more neurologically in one day and then more metabolically. And like if you don't have a rationale for why you're adding one thing or the other, and how much of it you're adding, then what stimulus you're getting is a crapshoot, right? And because that's an individual level too, because it's all contextually from where we are. One person's 6 reps is another man's 12, from a physiology standpoint, and that's just the reality. So it's like you need to know, once this is how you're affecting, like how do I go in the direction that I want? And that's where there's a big difference between adding sets versus reps versus load, and the difference of how much. So a really good example for you guys, just to kind of illustrate this concept, is the variable that is the smallest is the one where if you increase it tends to make it's the biggest jump in, we'll call it volume for the sake of this, right? So for instance, if you're doing like say 6 sets of 3, like 6 triples, okay, if all of a sudden you go up a rep, that's a lot, right? That going from 3 reps to 4 reps is a lot, okay? But if we were say doing 3 sets of 15, going up a rep to 16 or even 17 is like, or even 18, it's less significant than what that other change was, right? Not only is it a smaller number of, like, it's small rep increase, but when you add in the load or whatever, it's very insignificant. But if we were to add a whole other set of 15, if we were to go from 3 to 4 sets, that's now a big jump. So the smaller the variable, the bigger the change. The bigger the variable, the smaller the change. So depending on what you're doing, what you pick to choose, or what you choose to progress, affects how big of a progression it is, but also which direction it's in, right? So, and load is a factor in that too, right? If you're doing 1,000 pounds in the leg press and you add 5 pounds, it's very different than doing a lateral raise with 10 pounds and then adding 5 pounds. In one case, you're adding 50% of your load. So you have to figure out, based off of all of those constraints of the decision I want to make, it's like, how do I progress in a way that gives me the size of progression and progresses me in that direction? And so what usually ends up happening is that we have to, like, maybe we can't go up and load every single week. Maybe we go up and load a couple weeks and then we have to go up in a rep, right? Or what I like to do also is I like to look at the RPE of these sets. And so one of the things that we do over time is we focus on increasing the stimulus. And if we're thinking effective reps from a mechanical tension perspective, is I'm going to try and start bringing up the average RPE over across those sets, right? So if I may start, I got 4 or 5 sets of an exercise and the average RPE is, a 7.5 or something. And so then the goal is like, all right, the whole purpose of us adding load or adding sets or whatever is to make sure that we either stay at that same average RPE or we bump it up a little bit. Because even if I go up in load or I go up in reps, if my relative intensity or proximity to failure goes down, from a mechanical tension stimulus, I would say that is a regression, not a progression, right? Now we could say that we have progressed because the same thing became easier if we're going with the philosophical definition, right? But I don't know. I'm not concerned about the past. I'm concerned about the future when I'm talking about progressive overload. And so it's more like, okay, I want to make sure that what we do today is I've either moved things to keep the stimulus the same in terms of proximity to failure, or I maybe have a goal of climbing that over time. Like my goal is to start with an average RPE of 7.5 and end with an average RPE of 9 or whatever it may be. And then what I will do is once you get to the point where you're working at such a high intensity that it's just not, it becomes unfeasible when your first set is an 8.5 on an exercise, right? Unless you're only doing like 2 sets or 3 sets, because what'll happen is you just start seeing, you're not able to, maintain performance. You start seeing performance declines because you're working too high intensity too early. Mm-hmm. That's where adding sets becomes a really valid tool, because now I can increase the amount of effective rep volume that I'm getting by adding a set, but bringing down the average RPE of those sets a little bit, right? So I'm using another set to accumulate a few more effective reps. So I'm able to basically subtract a few of those effective reps out of the earlier sets because I'm getting them in the later. And now I have more sets from which to start to slowly climb that RPE again. So it's kind of like this.
I really like the way you planned it out, but in your course with the intensity, volume, and that place in the middle of the bell curve. But if you can kind of stay there longer, you can adjust intensity or volume without actually going too far in either direction to then extend the amount of time you can train there. Because what tends to happen is people go out of that, or they go too minimal, and then they can't keep progressing longer term, and then they'll have to deload more frequently. Generally, if you're only dealing in one thing. Especially assuming everyone's going hard.
Yeah. So a simple way to look at applying this stuff from base principle perspective is, one, you should have your targets that you're trying to progress, whether that be load, whether that be RPE, whatever. You should be like, okay, these are the things I'm trying to work towards. And then you should also have constraints, which would maybe be like rep ranges. Like, okay, like I'm trying to progress, but I'm trying to stay within this rep range as I go through those progressions. So that might mean that I can add weight. Maybe if I add weight, I lose a rep, but it's still okay. Or maybe I add reps and then I need to add weight to bring the reps back down. So you need a combination of, this is my primary thing that I'm trying to progress. And then these are the constraints that I have on there, right? There's almost never a constraint on load. Like, and when I say almost never, I mean almost, because you could come up with a few ideas of like, well, I don't want to go over this amount, right? It could be maybe you're actually training for a competition where you like need to like rep perform a certain weight or whatever it may be. But once you have that, then it's kind of like you're kind of bumper bowling now with the variables that you have within those constraints, but you're just trying to use the one that you're targeting the most often to continue to get that progress. So if your goal is like, all right, I'm trying to maintain a certain RPE within a certain rep range. Now I have the ability to use reps and load, and I can choose whichever one of those is going to be either a bigger or a smaller progression based off of how either the previous workout felt or how I feel going into today, whether, okay, which one of these is a bigger jump that is likely going to make this the appropriate RPE for me today, right?
You can essentially chase the pump.
Oh.
But you can chase the
Branding.
thing that you're going for, because you have more. I like the idea of bumpers because like Jeb and I kind of use that with the double progression stuff. But you can give yourself a set of rules, and then the win for the workout isn't necessarily like if it's always strength based or it's always set based or it's always rep based. You give yourself less room for error. And then I think that that's where problems occur, where if you can actually just use your brain and start to feel how you feel with these bumpers, you can basically hit your target because it is moving. We can agree that it's probably moving. Things aren't just like this.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I do like the reps and reserve thing or the RPE. For me, RPE was always, I always fall back more to, I guess, strength stuff. The reps and reserve thing, I feel, works for me just in that idea of like, all right, you know, I got 2 reps left. Let's cut it here.
But it gives you more things, I guess, even as a coach, like what you're saying is like, we can also probably all agree that like some people fucking suck at RPE or IRR. But if you kind of not suck at reps and sets within a range, you can probably have less, you probably can hit your target anyways, even if you suck at one of those. Yeah. Would that be kind of the thing? You have more bumpers essentially. So there's more room to actually hit that effective reps thing.
Yeah, I mean that's the goal. Is if you put constraints on, it's like, okay, I can use any of these tools, right, to continue hitting that target, right? So it's, you know, it's like going out to the shooting range and you have like, well, I got a bow and arrow, I got a pistol, I got an AK, I got a shotgun or whatever, right? And it's like, okay, we're putting up a target 300 yards away. All right, now I'm going to use something different. Then it's like, all right, no, I'm putting a sheet of plywood up 10 feet away. It's like, no, now I'm going to pull out some birdshot and just blow a big hole in that.
Yeah.
So at any point in time, if you have those constraints on, as you start to adapt, it's like, man, I have options here. And that's what I don't like about like, we'll just use reps and load and, you know, go that way. Or it's like, you have to add sets. And the reality is I think that, you know, if you look back a couple of years and you look at these camps, they were much more divergent. And what they've done is they've kind of like they've been creeping closer to each other without wanting to really like admit that like, yeah, it's somewhere in between both of us. But like they're converging on a simple point of like, well, yeah, you know, sometimes you can add sets. Well, yeah, adding sets, but you still need to go up and like the conversations are becoming closer and closer to somewhere in the middle.
Well, and what you're describing kind of gives us that within the constraints gives us that idea of auto-regulation, right? Because if you're hitting your load and you're supposed to be like 8 to 10 reps, but you're like, oh shit, I'm only at 7 RPE here. I can take that to 12 reps and then I get to that 8 RPE and I'm doing that, you know, within my framework, giving myself some sort of auto-regulation.
And I like the constraints because I see some people, they apply the RPE thing, but then their loads or their reps are all over the place, right? They had a set of 18 and then had a set of 7 and then a set of 5 or something. And I'm like, those are not the same. Those are not the same training conditions. And being able to auto-regulate when you have that much variability is it's not efficient or intelligent to do.
But what about just squeezing the muscle harder? Cass?
Yeah,
get more tension.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how many reps you do, as long as you have a hard squeeze.
This might be somewhere to start too, because I know we're talking a lot about RPE and stuff. How do you go about teaching people or like giving them bumpers to kind of feel these RPE things? So I think we alluded to it, but like people suck at it. How do you not suck at RPE, or how do you at least get that feeling of where you should be? Because this is a system that's really hard to use if you don't understand that to the point where you can feel these bumpers and know when to stop. Otherwise, you just go off the cliff. Yeah. Well, so if you want your RPE or RAR to be accurate, and I guess I'll preface this with saying like I use RPE a lot in discussion, but I don't preferentially say RPE is better than RAR. It's just that when we're talking about these concepts, it's a lot easier to talk about RPE because RAR is inverse. And then I have, like I say, this thing's going up and this thing's going down and it gets really confusing really fast. Right. Like I'll even screw myself up sometimes, but in terms of actual application, I believe that like, you know, there's
there's definitely reasons to use both. So it's not that one's better than the other. They both have application context and at an individual basis in terms of whatever measure you use for proximity to failure. Like if you want it to be accurate from a technical perspective, well, you got to know what actual failure is. So there's that, right? And if you want to know what actual failure is, well, then you've got to define what actual failure is, because what is failure? Is it volitional failure? Is it task failure? Is it like, and for me, what I'd look at from a failure perspective is just like, okay, failure is when we can no longer complete a rep that meets a certain amount of conditions, whether that be from technique, whether that be from speed, whether that be from a percentage of range of motion, right? And so I got to know what that endpoint is, right? And then I can take something to that endpoint, and now I know what that is, and then I reverse engineer my RPE or RIR from there. That gets me technically accurate. But in terms of from a progressive overload perspective, the only thing that really needs to happen is I need to be able to be comparable or consistently comparable, right? Because you will have people that they just underreport, and you'll have other people that overreport. And to be honest, that's a wash, because it's all that's going to happen is it's like, well, at an underreporter, I'm going to write their programs. They're going to average, and they're going to average a higher RPE or whatever, right? Does that mean that they're like the super beast, and this other person that like, over reports or whatever is like not, or something like that? It's like, no, because I'm not comparing people to each other, right? I'm comparing them to themselves. So all I'm doing is making sure that we're moving in the right direction. So if my goal was to take you from, a 7 to an 8 RPE, or from a 4 to a 3 RIR, all that matters is that we moved in that direction, that amount, because it doesn't really matter what that measurement was on the paper, whether it was a 3, a 4, a 2, or whatever. All that matters is that I wanted to progress you in this direction by roughly this amount. Did we accomplish that or not, right? I mean, if you want to come up with a system that's all, Roman numerals, or you want to use like, omega and alpha and whatever, like it doesn't matter what it is. All that matters is that you can consistently go in the direction. You can track the direction that you're going, and was this harder or easier than last weekend? Is it a lot harder or a little harder? Or is it the same? At that point in time, you're fine.
That's the coaching aspect, right?
Yeah. Well, because there's so many things that affect your perceived effort. Somebody's going to report their RPE differently on a squat than they are in a bicep curl.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Especially if they're not, you take a really advanced person and they really understand what these principles are, and they're going to be more technically accurate. Okay. But somebody else, there's going to be a variety of factors that go into what they're, how they're reporting this, right? It's like, well, okay, was I scared the weight was going to crush me? Okay, well then maybe I'll report things that feel heavier differently than things that burn, or things that make my heart rate go up or make me go out of breath, or things that like, that was technically difficult. Like I felt like I was, I had lost the ability to do it well, or like there's a lot of factors that can go in this. And that's where just communicating with the client what you want them to be reporting on. But it's just understanding that there's going to be fluctuations in that. All right. So somebody reports a squat at a set of 9, and they report a preacher curl as an RP of 6 or whatever. And they might have been close to the same muscular failure in those two things, depending on how they're interpreting, what is effort and what is failure.
I don't think I've ever gotten an RP of 6 on a preacher curl.
Yeah.
It's like rep 1. It's like, oh, fuck, here it goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But who you will get that in, though, is a lot of very untrained people, because the squat is an exercise that maybe they don't feel it's more technically challenging. It's more systemically fatiguing. And if not, they're not very strong. They go in and they do preacher curls, and it's just not that much discomfort to them. Mm-hmm. Right. Like they're not able to make it that hard, but because
a squat's scary.
But that's the difference too. I think, like, even in understanding, like, because I would be that person. Like deadlifts just always feel heavy and shitty, and they feel shitty whether they're heavy or whether they're at 405. So or 700 pounds, obviously. But I think understanding the difference between systemic and local it is something that gets lost. I think even with that intermediate crowd is because they're different RPEs. Like you said, squat's going to feel harder for someone and someone it's not if they suck at it or whatever, right? There's so many variables into it. So defining those, at least as a coaching client relationship, you can then at least, again, put those bumpers up for them.
Yeah. That's why if you want to be technically accurate, you need to define failure and then you need to go and achieve it.
Yeah.
That's the only way to be technically accurate, right? Or you actually have a way of measuring velocity and you have a really, really good coach's eye and all of that stuff too. Like, sure, you could use a lot of technology to do this, or you could simply say, all right, well, what do you think this was? Cool. All right, well, we're going in this direction. And maybe instead of trying to front load the education, you slowly communicate them a little bit more precise over time. Or you can take the onus on you of like, well, I'm learning how this person reports, and I'm going to adapt. I'm going to make a little note like, yeah, this person hates hamstrings. So every leg curl is rated at a 14 RPE or whatever it may be, right?
This is actually kind of cool because we had this discussion with Jordan and Stu with essentially, we're making fun of small people, but they'll use the metrics to kind of do less work because they're like, oh, they bought into camps. But you're kind of using metrics to chase getting big and like actually working hard. So it's weird because like that approach isn't making it as far into like that metric based crowd, because the metric based crowd, a lot of them are getting smaller, but you are using it to get bigger.
I think what you're saying too, it crosses boundaries. Like I could use that same principle with nutrition clients, right? Like I can say like, okay, we know where you're at. Instead of just dumping a bunch of information on you and freaking you out and overloading you, instead I can just, okay, we know where you're at. And so let's add a little bitty tweak and we'll get you there. And then, in 12 weeks, you're going to be pretty well educated and not feel overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is where when you look at all of these things, you have a certain amount of emphasis you're going to put on the physiology, a certain amount that you're going to put on the psychology, and a certain amount that you're going to just put on the, the practicality and the logistics of things to get the best overall. Because we work in a real world, right? We're not in a lab setting, right? And we're also not here to just like coddle people either. Like, so it's like, we need to have this nice synergistic blend of all of these things, right? And that's what's ultimately going to give us the best.
This is actually good, like, because we could talk about this for hours. So I actually want to touch on this, and we'll bring you back. We'll obviously jam on other stuff, but I think with your lab, so you have a lab and you're starting to test out some of these things. Where do you have the most questions on even your own methodologies on where do you kind of go to try to look for answers to improve this thing? Because now you are going to try to answer some of these questions that then improve this model. So where are you going with that? At least like kind of conceptually, because I know it's the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, we are definitely in no shortage of questions that we're going to try and answer. But I would say, so I was talking to a buddy the other day. I sent him like a preview of a thing we did on the scapular retraction. Spoiler alert, you should be focusing on over retracting on pressing movements. But anyway, he's like, yeah, so you're going to have a lot of these I told you so like studies on there. And I'm like, well, yeah, because we're trying to put tangible validations behind what we do. But in terms of like challenging like our own system, I think the biggest place to open up some work is actually looking at what's going on as we get into these effective reps and closer to failure. And we have models for why we do pre-exhaust, post-exhaust, and stuff like that. That's another area. So it'll be trying to look in and see if we can kind of support some of the mechanisms of what we think is going on to support the rationale for why we do this. Because essentially what we're going to try and do is through better protocol design and overlapping the technologies of EME and, NIRS and muscle oxygen saturation, force and velocity is like, if we like, instead of taking and saying, looking at one of those things, if we look at all of those things, knowing both the pros, cons, and limits of each of those technologies, can we actually start to break through some of this null hypothesis of nothing matters? Because that doesn't align with what we see anecdotally at all. Like things matter, right? Like if, it's like, okay, we make changes in people's programs. They don't get the same result doing one thing as they do the other, right? Whether that's a change in volume, change in intensity. We started doing supersets or cluster sets or whatever. And I think that's the biggest thing for us, is starting to try and pull apart some of that stuff that previously it's just been showed to be like, I don't know, like we put these people in. And the nice part is we're focusing on things that we can take some acute information right away. Meaning that if I'm gonna do some stuff on squats today, on heel elevation versus not heel elevation, and some different settings on our squat bar in terms of like anterior versus posterior loading and whatnot. And I'm going to show how, like, well, you know, if I go up on a heel wedge, but I do the same like ass back squat, the heel wedge doesn't do anything, which is exactly what happened pretty much in that research study of like, well, does a heel elevation make a thing? And then I'll actually intentionally drive my knees forward and show like, well, there's a massive difference. But we'll get that data on the day. I don't need to run an 8-week or a 16-week trial to be able to show the differences with this technology. And then the goal is that if we can show that there's an acute difference, then somebody else that wants to run a 8-week, 16-week, 20-week trial for hypertrophy or whatever will have a better protocol to do that with.
That's
right?
Sweet, man. That's to be able to like change the research through, you know, just
you're gonna get so much heat, dude. I don't give a fuck. It's gonna get so mad at you because all the bros are like, man, this fucking works. Science is way behind, and you're gonna be like, well, like now you're gonna be like, well, I bought my own research stuff. They're like, yeah, and then evidence-based, they're gonna be like, I don't give a fuck. You're an idiot.
Yeah. Well, and the nice thing about this stuff is that like it's easier for us to control for bias. Obviously, there's a certain amount of bias in what we do.
Yeah.
But also, it's like, you know, we're gonna do some of this stuff live, right? And every rep we do is recorded. So like literally, like there's no fudging the data. Like we got a system through Naraxon that basically syncs the video footage with the EMG, and like it's all in line. So if I want to stop somewhere in a rep, I can see exactly where I'm at in terms of range of motion. You can see what I'm doing. Like,
you're not scared of being wrong, though. I think that's a huge thing. Is like you're just looking for answers, and like you're just not willing to wait for the research. And like,
yeah,
you're probably the first person who would say if you're wrong, or like at least I don't know. I feel that you're not a liar generally. I'm sure you.
Well, we haven't been right about everything, but the thing is that we're not attached to a paradigm. The nice thing about being an N of one approach is that, well, how do you do this? And I'm like, well, it depends. What we do is we create a lot of principles, and we try and come up with a way of how we would optimize that approach. And so basically all we're going to do is we're going to be able to refine our principles. We're going to be able to fill in gaps, make tweaks, and pivots. But it's not like I'm like, no, I'm a high volume guy. So if all of a sudden we find out that, you know, low volume is better, I'm going to be like eating my words. It's like, no, that's
learn
not
other people's stuff
at all.
Like, I think like that's not a big thing that I have with people, but there's a lot of arguments, like in whatever, we can talk arguments on Facebook, internet, and all this shit. But a lot of people that are making fun of these systems don't actually take them. Like, I would say that you've taken a lot more than you'll tell people you've taken, but just so you can talk about it and then use it as an N equals 1 because you're not married to it. And I think that we do need more of that, even if we have a little bit of an echo chamber and bias. Like, I don't give a fuck about that. But you are trying to learn other shit and see where it fits in your model, because you'd rather steal everyone's shit if it works.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? Is we're seeking truth, right? And then we're seeking to find a way to make that truth digestible. And I mean, because that's ultimately our that's our brand, right? It doesn't revolve around any specific dogma about anything. Like, the only thing, like if we did have a dogma is that a thing should be individualized. Like that's the one thing that we kind of like, you know, swear by and put our hat on is that, like, well, how should you do this? Well, it depends on the individual.
What about RDLs versus deadlifts?
Yeah, like what about them, right? I mean, they're two different things. It's not
No,
that
man,
one's good or one's bad. But
yeah, RDL's better. I love camps. I think like this is why it's hard with you, because like we'll try to like push a camp and you're like, well, like, it depends. You're like the best it depends person, but you actually give an answer, which is like awesome.
Well, the thing is with the camps is a lot of times, like, we'll put it this way: if you formed a camp, you're probably at least partially right in the context that you're looking at it in.
Yeah.
The problem is that most people don't give people the context that they're looking at it in. They just make the claim, like, oh yeah, this is better. But better for what? Better for who? Better how? But like, no, this is just better. And that's just bad, right?
Well, and I think like if anyone's listening to this, and like obviously like we're talking about things and not going into all of it, because we're just talking about it. But like you do have courses and education on this, and it's not to push that. It's just like at the end of the day, like you do got to make money on this stuff, and like it's just you can't do it justice in this circle. But it's nice to talk about principles so that people at least have, okay, you should probably go learn this, or you should go learn this, or you should pay for this, because at the end of the day, you do it too.
Having gone through some of this education, like I'm 100% okay pushing it on here. Like I'm 100% okay saying like, hey, like if you want to get better and you want to invest in something, I'm 100% saying like this is a good investment. I mean, the production quality is incredible. I think the way that the pieces are set up are really set up to facilitate learning versus just spewing information.
That's the only hard part though, is that they're not like, you're basically not selling ebooks that are cheap, because like you have an E equals all approach. It's way too complicated. Which is like your guns.
And that's an inherent flaw in the way that we try and like the way that we not only approach the education process, but the way that people start applying what they've learned, because it's not this linear thing where it's like you start learning things and it's this, as my knowledge, I learned this little thing, my application, my understanding goes up. It's kind of like there's these base foundational things that can be generalized, right? Like, okay, calorie balance or energy balance. Like, all right, that's a pretty base, principle, right? And then, okay, can we put volume markers or frequency markers and, just kind of like put some ranges and some constraints and generalization on things. Like, okay, cool. You kind of get those basic things like, okay, here's some basic stuff about mechanics, et cetera. It's like, but then the next level it's not a linear jump. It's a big jump. And there's this like huge gap where as you start learning stuff, you have just as much of a chance of doing shit more wrong than better, because it's like, I now have a very detailed, nuanced view on a partial piece of the big picture. And it's like, until you fill more of that big picture in, it's very easy to start misusing that information or applying it out of context. And that's why,
that's what I respect about it. Even on the live, like the one dude was kind of pissed off, but it was just like, you should read more. And like, you weren't saying that, you're just like, dude, like this thing is like so much bigger than what you're saying. And if you want to work out in those basic understanding, that's fine. But then we can't have this conversation. And I'm totally cool pushing getting smarter and learning and putting in the hard work, because it's just like getting bigger. Like, to get smarter and actually start looking at these things, you actually have to do the work. And you're not selling quick, which is unfortunate for you. But I think that you've stuck to your guns on that, where you're not going to sell the fucking simple picture, because you're like always context and go read and do all this stuff because you did it.
Yeah. Well, my goal is not to have, 20,000 coaches, run through our program and then move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
My goal is that the coaches that we do get, like, are going to continue to grow with us through their career, and basically to make a platform that is going to support them throughout that process. And this is just having been through that experience and having mentored coaches, I have a very strong personal attachment to the dysfunctions of that education process and the impact that it has on the lives of people going through that. Like, I've seen way too many people that are, they're good people that are essentially, they're crushed or defeated by a system that essentially is either giving them false promises or, whatnot. And I don't think when you're in the pursuit of bettering yourself, that you should have to be risk adverse to, like, well, if I go learn this thing, am I just going to be out my money, or is it going to make me worse? Am I going to find out like in a month that like, oh, this was like, not good information, or this was useless, or whatever. It's like, oh, I went to this course and the whole purpose of this course was to sell me this other course, which its purpose was to then to sell me the mastermind, and, and so on and so forth. It's like, to me, it's like in our job as coaches, trainers, like ultimately we're in a health profession, but we're in a profession of trying to help people. So there's this big, like, exponential domino effect.
Yeah.
If we make good coaches, the lives that they impact, that's just such a huge thing. And so for me, I have a very strong personal like bias to like, man, we need to have a higher standard of education in this field because of how much of an impact it has, not only just on the lives of the people that directly consume it, but then the lives of the people that work with them. It's already, it's already a fringe niche anyway, right?
Well, you and Ben actually have a very similar, so Ben House, not to say that like Ben was just like in one of his presentations, really, if you don't know this, you got to go fucking learn it. But it wasn't to sell another thing. And like, I think that you had that in progressive overload, like, hey, we're going to talk about stimulus, but like a deep understanding of this is in this other thing. But it wasn't to sell that. It was like, you were laying the cards out and saying like, to do this thing right, it's not a quick fix. And so you're basically the equivalent of selling not sexy. Which is fine, because again, I think that brings up the standard, because it's not selling you fucking magic beans.
Yeah. And to be honest, the world's changing right now. And if you're a coach listening to this, like we're moving in a direction where I think that if you're not exceptional at what you do, technology is going to replace you. Yeah, right. Absolutely. Like, and I think that's actually a good thing for the industry as a whole, because it's going to weed out people that just don't have their heart, in this, that aren't fully committed. But that, if this is what you want to do, this is now a time where it's like, man, you really need to make sure that on all aspects of this, right? Just not just the technical perspective, but the service delivery and everything, right? Is that, man, you should really focus on being a better coach. And, I'll rant on this because you guys like rants, but like I get like 10,000 ads for like, oh, take your business online, create your own, app.
I love this argument.
And it's, it's like, no, you need to elevate yourself, you or your product, because unless you have the ability to like massively invest in an app or whatever, like right now, there's a ton of people that are making poor investment decisions in either terms of moving their business completely online or investing in these apps or extravagant websites or whatnot. And in reality, it's like, are you skipping over the product for all of this other stuff, right? And because that's going to be the thing, is everybody's making this, they're going to highly invest, and all it's going to take is a few people that have tremendous resources to do it really well, because the internet reaches an infinite number of people right now, right? And you can't, as a coach that wants to work with people, you can't compete with like, a big corporate like app model type thing.
Like a
right?
good enough app model.
Yeah, but they can't compete with you on service.
No.
Right.
And so that's where you have to separate yourself. No, there's nothing wrong with having a professional platform or doing things with technology and utilizing it as your tool. But I think a lot of people are, making poor investments in terms of like, they're not improving the quality of their products. Like, hey, you might actually be better off instead of like, focusing on, building this app. Like, well, how's your communication skills right now? Right. Because if you need to do 20 videos and like, you're like, and nobody like relates to you, it's like, well, that was a terrible idea. Like, some people should write. Some people are good on camera. Some people are going through the effort of this is one of the things that always gets me. Like, we built this huge exercise library with the intent for our coaches to use it. Like, okay, cool. This is done. It's technical. It's got all these fancy features or whatever. Like, now use this with your clients. And so many people have like been like, okay, now I'm just going to copy that and I'm going to make they go through this whole investment of time and money.
It's so dumb.
Just so that like just so that like it's a different person doing the thing. Like, and I understand like from a branding perspective, but it's like, well, how important was it that you invested, hundreds of hours and $10,000 or whatever into refilming all of those little exercise clips when you could have invested that into a lot of different things for your business, right? Like you could have learned more, you could have done advertisement marketing, like so many other things that you could do instead of repeating what's already done. And I think that's the way that our industry needs to move forward is that we just need to stop. Like there's an abundance of people doing the same thing, like just repeating what other people have done. And if we want to get better, we need more people focusing on adding to that, right? Because like right now, the amount of people that are innovating in this industry is actually very small.
Mm-hmm. Like, or at least trying to combine stuff. Like that's the one reason why, like, because we look at the old guard, and I'm not gonna say the old guard, even the current guard is like everyone's trying to be shittier. I know I've had this rant before, but everyone's trying to be shittier versions of the people emerging that have these ideas or the thought leaders. And I don't know if you want to play that game, because if you again make your product better, or do better, or like start combining things, and like you've kind of combined a lot of stuff, but you've also like had your own thoughts. But unless you're that person, you're not going to get a thing you want. So then just, if you want to just make money, then just fucking learn about sales and be shitty. If you want to be this thing that you say you want to be, like stop copying, and not even copying, but like start being better.
Yeah. The irony is with the research that we've done is the copying is the poorest ROI. Like you would be better off spending all of that effort and money on marketing and having a very simple product than trying to have just all of this content that's just copycatted or whatever. Because I mean, to be honest, like if you're putting out copycat content, it might get you followers, it might get you a few likes, but it doesn't like move your brand, forward that much, right? It's like this, like we created this progressive overload course only because we could build on what's out there in the industry, right? Like I'm not creating any content that I could just say, hey, go do this. Like my best example of this is always precision nutrition, right? Like they do certain things really, really well. Could I try and emulate that, like, and create my own version of that course? Absolutely. We could do it in a couple, we have the knowledge and the technology to just replicate that. Like, sure. But why? Why would I do that when I could invest that same time and money into doing something else that doesn't exist? Right. Like buying a lab that I could have bought like a Corvette instead of.
Yeah. But what is that game you long?
But it's funny because it's like, and I think we're at this point now where I don't know, we have this with Jordan, this conversation, maybe I had it on my other podcast with the Fitness Devil, but it's the opportunity to make shittier versions of stuff is so at our fingertips. Like we can get Final Cut Pro and they have packages, and they have websites where you can do educational courses. So everyone's trying to do it. And it's just like, if you look at the graveyard of shitty products that have tried to do what other people have done, it's just, if you're a logical person in the fitness industry, like, is that where you want to put your eggs? Yeah. And so it's just like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a very few people that I believe can do it. And so do a logical introspection. Are you that person? Are you the one? I don't know.
Your face swap videos are the perfect analogy for this activity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what.
But actually the fucked up thing is, like, I was like, well, no one's doing it, so I'm just gonna keep doing it. And I thought everyone was gonna do it. I'm like, sweet, I can stand out. But like,
it gave me fucking nightmares. I saw Jason Sudeikis' face on all these different women pop stars. And why do you look so much like Jason Sudeikis? That's what I want.
I don't know, but like,
it's fucking weird.
I actually look like a lot of people when I put my face on there, because there's some people who it's like, okay, it's off-putting, but like I'm like a white male with like a normal face, so I kind of look like a large portion of these people. But anyways, first the market. Like I had the idea, how many ideas right now are new and innovative, and how many people are actually pushing that? And I think people think that they go learn about Eric Helms or Israel or your stuff, and they're like, well, I'm doing it differently now. It's like, no, you're not. Like, why try to be better than that? I don't know. It's a weird spot because like you also can't tell people not to try because then you lose that progression of it. But I think that people don't have a complete understanding of where they stand on that totem pole. Like I think that people are actually with the internet, they don't know where they stand. They think that they're fucking the best because of their followers.
Well, I think people try to develop something before they have the skill set to develop something. Like we always talk about this with my next progression. It's not because I decided this. It's because I was working with these people and I saw a need, and I actually am really good at this one thing that I would have never in my life chosen to chase after. And it just progressed on its own.
Yeah, I think when people are looking at innovating, being creative, etc., too many people are trying to be a better version of someone else instead of a better version of themselves. And that's where, like, if you're like, okay, I'm going to look at what Eric Helms is doing, and then I'm going to try and do a better version of that. Well, it's like, well, way to set the bar high, right? Like, you know, like you're looking at the top of the people that have accomplished a ton and have a ton of knowledge and years of experience underneath them. And it's like, okay, I want to do what they're doing, but better, instead of focusing on, why don't you do a better job of what you're doing in a way that actually benefits the people that are working with you. And that's something that just from across the board, that like from, I think in this industry, because it's a very ego and narcissistic, like bias industry, right? That so many people gear what they're going to do and the direction that they're going to go based off of their comparison to the other professionals rather than what actually serves the people that I'm working with. Because it doesn't take a lot to get better at helping the people that you're supposed to be helping. Yeah. Like you don't have to be better than anyone else out there to get better at helping the people that you're working with. And as you keep focusing on that, the end product of that is going to be different than everybody else. And that's how you're going to be original, because you're going to work with different people. You're going to have different experiences. And you're going to find the best way for you to apply this. You're going to find the system that works best for you over time, rather than saying, well, I'm going to take the system that these guys do, right? And then I'm going to, just do a copy of that, instead.
I think you can also layer on, like, if you actually like doing educational course and you want to learn that's your fucking calling, and it ends up being a shittier version of someone else, but it wasn't planned like that. Like, that's a different story than like looking at the top and trying to reverse engineer what they did and rebuild it back up. Like, we can use this podcast, for example, but it's like, I was listening to the Eric Helms one before this on Iron Culture. It's like, Eric can start any podcast and it's going to be better than everyone else's because he has the following and he has the knowledge and he has this thing. And there's like fucking 30 other podcasts trying to do like a muscle hypertrophy fucking training podcast, where Jeb and I were just like, well, we just like doing it and we can talk to our friends and it's about this thing, but like, I'm not going to try to be fucking, who's a barbell shrug. Like, they have millions of views a week. It's just, but I have that internal understanding of that. So it's different. You know what I mean? Yeah. As opposed to being like, I'm going to make barbell shrug. Like, no, you're not. Like, I'm going to make a better podcast than this person. I'm going to be a better hypertrophy program than this person. Like, nah, it's probably not going to happen. So just do it because you like it, or actually, like you said, do the things that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, because you have this thing it is now, right? The trajectory needs to be better, a better version of this in a month from now, and a year from now.
Like you said, the bigger companies come in and smash. Actually, that's Eric Helms is a good one, because like, it's not that old, their podcast, but even you could put a podcast and do better than probably like 95% of people's podcasts, just because you're a bigger company. You can come in and crush it because you have the education, you have all this stuff. It's like, God, that's a risk. Talk about Eric Helms' asymmetrical risk. That's fucking not asymmetrical. You better love it if you're going to do it.
Yeah, and it's a perfect example of like trying to find things that are a good investment for you, right? Like, there's a reason that we haven't started a podcast yet, because it's like, all right, how competitive, how much benefit would it be versus me? Like, for right now, it's a better opportunity for me to come and talk in front of somebody else's audience, because I'm already speaking in front of my audience in long form content or whatnot. Just giving them one other place to listen to me is not going to be the thing that really, propels my business forward, right?
I think it'll compete with yourself. Because then they'll be like, well, I don't have to take this course. I can listen to him say that. Or at least with this one, we're not going to tell you everything. And we're the ones who will straight up say it. We're not going to tell you everything. Go this fucking course. But if you do it, they're going to be like, oh, I don't need to take his course. I took it right from him on the podcast. Like, fuck.
Yeah.
I think that's
Put on
probably
ours all the time.
a
Like,
good place to start wrapping up here.
Yeah. It's like, how do we get here? Okay. You can wrap it up. How would Jeb wrap it up?
I mean, I think the bottom line we come down to is progressive overload is dictated by how we define it instead of, you know, how we have traditionally done so. And I think that's a big thing. And at the end of the day, a good place to learn about this is N1 education. I have no problem pushing a product that I believe in, and like bottom line, and I think Dean, you feel the same exact way, which is why we always have Cass on, but like it's different. It's not like a lot of the educational offerings out there, in that, again, I think it sounds silly, but the technology put into it, I mean, it's so dumb, but watching that damn when you walk on that damn dry erase board thing is sweet. But also just, I do think it's really well developed, and it hits on the educational needs of people, I think, better than a lot of other offerings, just in the way it's broken down, and just as simple as like the time constraints on it. But I think it's, again, if you're interested about this shit, like invest in the courses, invest in the things that matter, and like you said, stop investing in shit that doesn't matter. Stop investing your time into making 400 exercise videos when you can go, you know, I mean, how many hours does that take? You know, I know what I bill hourly, and you know, for about 10 hours I can do one of these courses, and I think that's a better use of time.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think if I add anything to that, on the progressive overload standpoint, it would just be the definition of progressive overload is fluid. Same thing with volume, et cetera. The key factor is that you have to make the definition relative to what you're trying to do. That's the big thing, right? So if you don't agree with my definition, that's fine, right? But the principles that my definition is based on remain, whether or not you decide that that's what progressive overload means or not. And so that's essentially the approach that you need to take when you're adjusting your training. And it doesn't matter what label you put on those principles, right? Like adding load versus adding reps versus adding sets versus changing tempo. Like all of these things are tools, right? How you want to categorize those tools is less important than if you know how to use those tools.
Sweet. Where do people find you again? If we haven't already figured that out.
Yeah. So you can follow me directly. Instagram's the best place, you know, because they don't rip us off on the engagement as much, at least the time going. So it's Coach_Kassem. You can follow, yeah, I mean, if you want to follow me on Facebook, go ahead, but like, you know, you'll see like one post every 60 days probably.
It's not as good.
Yeah. And then we have two platforms. So we have N1.education and N1.training. It's very simple. Like the education platform is meant for people that are interested in the more nuanced coaching level stuff. Our N1 training stuff is a really good place to start, because you're just going to pick up the very basic stuff, like a lot of what we do in terms of exercise mechanics and, you know, foundational level principles. That's a good place to go. But we put a lot of content on both of our brand pages. My pages is pretty random, and our websites are respective of that. N1.education and N1.training. No .coms on those. That's the biggest mistake people usually make, is they put a .com. But we are not a commercial site. We are an education site. So that's why we are .education.
The one difference is that, for anyone listening before we close it up, is if you're going to ask Cass, if you can ask him a question on his personal page, he'll tell you, he's the guy that will say, like, that's a stupid question.
Yeah.
Oh, but
I totally respect that, because I hate that there's no stupid questions. He's like, listen, coming on my page, we're talking complicated shit. Like don't ask that fucking question. Like, get out of here. Yeah. Which is awesome.
The training and education sites are great though, because our Instagram.
If you ask on the company page, they'll be nicer.
But I did the shoulder complex today, and it's fucking fire. The cable Y raise to the and then the kneeling. That's why I like it. I love getting the exercise selection stuff.
Yeah. So and to answer or to comment on Dean's thing, it's not that I say that they're stupid questions per se, as much as there's times and places to have certain conversations, right? And for some people, you're just not at the point in that journey. Like, you haven't done the due diligence to have that conversation at that time or place at that.
You're willing to say that because you're not
Yeah.
looking for his money per se. You are, but you're telling the truth. Like you're telling the people the thing that they need to hear.
Yeah. Ultimately, that's the most beneficial answer that I can give at that point in time.
Yeah.
Right? Versus like, okay, cool, I'm going to tell you something that you are either not going to be able to understand, or you're not going to take away from it. You're not going to take away a thought process or principle that you can use appropriately. I'm essentially going to give you a loaded gun that you don't know how to use if I answer this and you're not ready.
And you're not in the business of handing out loaded guns because you don't believe in that. Okay, sweet buddy. Okay, I'll end it now, and I'll probably have to edit it because I know how you are. Like, we'll edit the one thing out, and yeah, take it easy, boys.
All right.
Yeah.
That's right. I have wrestled with an alligator. I done tussled with a whale. I done handcuffed lightning, throw thunder in jail.
You can't stop me.
I'm going to win. It ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
I just keep getting stronger.
Stronger?
Stronger. Stronger.